Good afternoon, everyone. A friend of mine, Chad, said, hey, I dug up this map from 1886 of Knoxville. There's a Star Fort right there. Why don't you go and take a look at that and do a video about it? Too bad it's under a neighborhood and the old diagrams clearly show the Star Fort. There was never any dates given for construction, but sure enough, the battle diagrams show the Star Fort front and center. And down to Chattanooga, same thing, Star Fort right there. Wiped away. A neighborhood sits on top of it now. Those of you interested in the mud flood, this is the University of Tennessee, 1864. How is it that there's no trees, no vegetation across this one of the most forested areas of the United States way back then? Just some out-of-place buildings sitting on a hill. And historians would have you believe this little tiny building with just 2 floors is that same building visible from 2 miles away, surrounded by other buildings that are at least 5 floors tall. A replica, perhaps? And a few years later, even though it's a university, it looks completely disused. Looking back in the past, Chattanooga, same Civil War era, why is there no vegetation? I'll present my findings. Leave it in the comments what you think below. And in the year 2020, it's so important to keep your body functioning at optimal performance. And collagen may be the closest thing we will ever get to a true fountain of youth. After all, collagen's the most abundant protein in your body and essentially the glue that holds it all together. Even worse, various lifestyle factors that you may have been exposed to, such as poor diet, lack of sleep, smoking, pollution, stress, all of these can deplete your collagen levels even faster. And the year-over-year loss of the most abundant protein in our bodies is the key reason that we start to look and feel older. When you're middle-aged, you're only producing half of the collagen you did in your youth. My focus is about digestive health, because the change in our diets from foods being unavailable and moving to seasonal harvests, and the entire spectrum of availability of foods is changing. There's so much more to talk about with the benefits of collagen. You can visit healthwithadapt2030.com to learn more. The link's in the description box below. So a friend of mine, Chad, also from Tennessee, said, hey, did you see these high-res maps that came out of the 1886 renditions of different cities around Tennessee? And he said, next time you're driving around through some of these cities, why don't you stop in Knoxville and then see if you can find this Star Fort? It would be an amazing video to do to talk about this. Image here of regular Star Fort that you might see around the world. These are everywhere. Earthenworks. And I thought, wow, even the battle diagrams have that in. So Knoxville, the Confederate troops were overrun, obviously, and they lost several battles across this area. Yet somehow this was just bulldozed over and completely forgotten. There's a name of a hospital of it, Fort Sanders, but now when you go to try to find vestiges of it, it lies in a neighborhood. Such a special era of history. You know, so many things are saved across the southeast U.S., but why are these Star Forts always the first things to go? John Levy's channel here, amazing researcher as well into the mud flood, Star Forts, Tartaria, and missing history. That one screen grab of the very detailed Star Fort came from his video, Star Forts and Mines. Definitely jump over to that channel. It is a wealth of information. I'm just presenting my little dot here of what I found around Knoxville that'll add in. Clearly on these maps from the 1860s, Fort Sanders, you'll see at the left, it's got even a circle with a star on it. And you'll start to see, if you come a little bit to the south and east, Fort Byington. Very clearly on the map. And you notice Fort Byington, hey, wait, that's the University of Tennessee. So these landmarks are clearly visible for us as we move through the rest of these maps we're going to look at here. These are the 2 areas, especially these 3 buildings that are so discernible on top of that hill, which is now University of Tennessee. And if you go through renditions of the Fort Sanders battle, you'll start to see Star Fort images in every single one of these. All right, I understand they cut down a few trees during the time here, made some forts, ramparts, fortifications and whatnot. You got to remember, the armies at that time small in comparison to what we have today. They're using horses, everything's human power. They didn't have chainsaws to rip everything down. And when you start to take a look at the size of this Star Fort here, it gets into the gargantuan sizes, just like we've seen across the planet. Now, there's never been even one indication of when this was built. Nothing. It's just conjecture. Around 1880, but there's never any engineering diagrams of it or when it was constructed. And we saw the same thing in Chattanooga. It was just there. The military used it, obviously. And they're pretty good size. And then what I also wanted to know, what is the spire in the background there? Because almost all the bigger buildings that are in Knoxville today weren't even built until the mid-1880s. Although this would be the University of Tennessee, and those three buildings looking back at that same hillside. Do you think artists of the day really got that spire that tall, that elongated, and that wrong compared to what that little tiny building from 1828 would have been on the horizon? But in addition to that Star Fort, what you see is earthwork fortifications all around the periphery of it as well. So this was actually outside the fort, as it would be like the first line of defense. And then finally, when they got back into the fort, repelling the Confederate attack and trapping them in those same trenches that were around the Star Fort. And what I want you to do is take a look at the landscape. There's nothing out there. And to reiterate, there was nothing out there. This is after the Confederate troops had surrendered. This is from an army camp looking over the river to what is now the University of Tennessee. But how out of place are those buildings right on the hill there, especially with the giant cathedral-looking spires? And as you look around, there's really nothing there. Totally gone. And you'll notice the roads and looks like infantry trails that had been carved through. It's very discernible that there's a lot of road traffic, a lot of equipment traffic across those deeper ruts and gullies. Very easy to see that. Now, when we step back a couple of years to 1863, and you can see those tributaries that are wrapping around the hill coming in to the river there. Now, when you look to the east, there's very little, if anything, and looking behind that, there's almost nothing either. So when I look at this, I say, wait a second. A, there's almost no trees in this entire area. Now, I understand farming at the time, but this is East Tennessee, where everything is covered in forest. I mean everything. If there's not a building on it, there's a tree growing there. And we're looking at an era in the 1860s when there was really not much mechanization to clear farm fields, horses, whatnot. But you're telling me everything as far as you can see is complete mud? I'm saying this was a mud flood reset area, and what was left on top of that hill was the previous, what would have been civilization, Tartaria, whatever you like to call it, that was here. These buildings are so out of place, and this mud is completely out of place as well. Wiped everything clean. And you saw the previous 1865 at the end of the Civil War photo, completely barren as well. Let's zoom in on this out of place structures here. As far as you can see in that landscape, not a single tree. What is going on there with this? And this is Civil War photography here. Confederate withdrawals. Obviously, Union troops kicked them. But we're looking at the Tennessee River. Obviously, that's a landmark, and you can see those buildings. And there's just a few things on the landscape that are visible for us. But here's where we come into La La Land. Because the East Tennessee College, the forerunner of University of Tennessee, moved to the hill west of downtown Knoxville in 1826. Okay, so now we're getting a date of those buildings built in 1826 in the wilds of Tennessee on a hill with zero trees. Okay, they put the fences there, and if that's farming, that is some of the largest agribusiness, even in today's standard. How many thousands and thousands of acres would that be? You got to realize they were doing it by horse back then. Yet we're led to believe that they, as far as you could see there, and that it was being farmed. But something else that's out of place here is Old College, the first building on the campus, was built in 1828 to be torn down in 1916. But they always are. You notice these great grandiose mansions always have a fire, and they're always removed by the 1920s. But notice the date 1828. How does that not sync with the University of 1826 with those large buildings that were there? And zoom in just for a second here. Look at the stairwell on the left, and you'll see it's only 2 floors tall. And when you're coming into the doors, the stairwell on the right and the left are both normal size to any of us going into a 2-floored house or building, if you will. I don't think it's that large. So keep that in your mind as a context for size when we compare to these other structures next to it. And just a little bit interesting with the timing of showing these renditions of 1826 with those giant structures up there, yet they say this only first one building was up there. So again, there's a lot of, in my opinion, conflicting history here. So now back to the size. The buildings on either side are at least 4 and possibly 5 floors tall, depending on how further over the horizon they are and what we can really see on the bottom. That building in the foreground, in my opinion, is about the size of the one that would be on the right. And it looks like the one in the foreground, the white one, would even be bigger than what we're seeing here for this 1828 building. And we're looking from about 2 miles away. And you're telling me a little square that's only 2 floors tall from 2 miles away dwarfs those other buildings that are 4 or 5 floors tall and at least double the length or width of that same structure we're looking at here. This is what they are telling you in the timeline of what it is. So I think that something was built very similar to look like that center building. And because history disappears all the time, and we are very lucky to have these photos out of the National Archives, because if this one photo of the National Archives after the victory in Knoxville, if that wasn't in there, this video would not be possible. It was just from one set of photos during that time compared to what was said by the quote-unquote historians. So I'll ask you, let your eyes decide if this is the same building that they're referencing as the first building or if it's a different set of buildings on that hilltop there. And this would also explain in that Star Fort image to the left, the very large spire that is elongated. It matches with this building on that hilltop if you look at how tall that spire actually goes into the air. Incredible heights. I wish the antenna was clearer on the top of it, but those two match. Now, this was supposed to be one of the most amazing universities in the eastern part of the U.S., here, University of Tennessee. The Science Hall, built in the 1880s. Yet when I look at it in 1903, it looks in pretty much disrepair to me there. I don't know about you, but let's compare the 1903 image here with this 1903 image here. Now, do you think those are both the same 1903, same era, same within the same 1 year? Or do you think that one's much older and this building was refurbished and they give it different dates? Again, I'd like to know what you might think in the description box below. And as well, you can see the largeness that the university had risen to. Again, 1903. This seems to be a very common date. 1903, 1906, 1886. They keep recurring again and again. They just like took these dates and slapped them on everything. But another thing to notice here, nothing grew through all those images that I showed you from the early 1820s. That top of the hillside here was completely bare. We come into the Civil War era, not a thing was growing anywhere in sight. Come up supposedly 30 years later, and look how large the trees have become. So one of two things has happened. Either it was the biggest massive deforestation campaign in human history to remove everything as far as the eye could see in East Tennessee back 150 years ago, or when the mud emanated from the earth, it had a different chemical composition that did not allow large tree growth, perhaps grasses. And until that was eroded away through the rains for a few decades, the trees couldn't take hold. Now they finally had a soil substrate that they could grow into, and that's why the trees returned. So I wonder how long it would be after a quote-unquote mud flood, or I call it a global liquefaction event, which we're set for in 2024, at least something similar, with magnetic displacement and our crust splitting a little bit or oozing or being impacted by a second magnetic field of the gas giants lining up with the Earth in the center and then the sun. Makes you wonder what's going on, really. Now, I do understand after we got into the 1900s, construction became much larger than it was in the 1880s. But I'll bring you right over here to Chattanooga. Different place, same story. Star Fort right next to the river. Easily discernible here. They're showing all these factories and whatnot, but I'll show you some images of Chattanooga. And where we look, it is marked on there, the Old Fort Wood, number 16. So I started digging around into Old Fort Wood, and here we go. We do have some diagrams. Nobody knows what the dates were that it was there. It was just there, and military took it over for operations and battlefield. And wouldn't you know, it's in a neighborhood now Completely covered. We can never visit it. But you know, so many battlefield areas have been set aside as parks and national treasures and whatnot. But somehow these Star Forts are just neighborhoods now. Makes no sense to me. And if we do look at the old Chattanooga, see, they were coming from the outside. So that was the very, very, very last line of defense before they got to the river, was at Star Fort. And you can see how the battle progressed. Again, Confederate troops wiped out in this one. But that Star Fort was the very last bastion. And it did protect the river coming upriver. Prior to the Civil War, it was used as a bastion to control river traffic. So obviously it was constructed before the Civil War because they talk about how it was used to protect river traffic. So let's bring you up to Chattanooga. This was supposed to be in the same era, 1864. What's the similarity to that? The hill from the 1864-65 era from Knoxville and University of Tennessee. No trees, again. What is it with a treeless landscape in all these photos, these images? And this is just a small spackling of what I found in my research. I'll be bringing you more of these videos, especially around Nashville, Knoxville, Chattanooga, and some up in Memphis as well. So thanks for watching. I'd like to hear your comments in the description box below, especially about the antennas, the building techniques, and the out-of-place, what appears to be global liquefaction event across the hills during and prior to the Civil War that just don't make sense. And since I am out here in East Tennessee starting a farmstead, you can check me out over on Patreon /ADAPT2030. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.